Hey there guys, so this time around we're taking a look at a new system from Reatan, and I've taken a look at one of their systems before, which was the Alloy 9. That was a Ryzen 9 7940HS based system, and I really liked that one. So what we have here is the Reatan Silver 9, and that is an Intel based system rocking a Intel i9 12900HK. It has 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1TB SSD. So let's get this thing out of the packaging. I'm very excited to check this thing out because I have been wanting to try out one of these mobile i9s for a while. And yes, it's 12th gen. It's quite a few generations old at this point, but at the price point that this comes out at, it's a pretty great value, especially considering the fact that the difference between 12th gen, 13th gen, and 14th gen is not that dramatic. So of course you get the typical warning information just in case if you have a slow boot time, what can end up causing it, and of course the warning to not remove the CPU cooler because it uses liquid metal. So that's interesting. Let's take this thing out of the box and let's see what else it comes with here. I want to know what the accessories it has are. As always, we got to check the power brick to see just how much power we're dealing with here. And of course, it is a 120 watt power brick. That should be more than enough juice for pretty much any type of system. And of course, we do get an HDMI cable that goes to the power brick, and we even get 2 spare feet. That's actually pretty interesting. But let's take a look at the system itself. Let's get it out of this packaging and we just pull it out. And it seems to be a very similar case design to the system that I took a look at before, the Alloy 9. Again, I was a big fan of the Alloy 9, so I have some pretty high expectations here. One of the best features of this case design is the fact that while it does use these rubber feet, they're meant to come out pretty easily. They have these little rubber tabs on the side that kind of just hook into there, and they hold on perfectly fine. I haven't lost the feet on the Alloy 9, and they do a pretty great job. You of course have the screws underneath, but in fact let's take them all off so we can open this thing and immediately take a look at what we're dealing with on the inside. Alright, and if I just pop this thing open, we can see what the inside is like. And of course we have a metal bracket here that is what is essentially letting this thing grab onto. You will have to remove that to get access to the SSD. It also appears to only have one SSD slot, which is pretty disappointing to see. I would have liked to have had at least a second NVMe. We do have the Wi-Fi card here, and of course when you open it, be careful because the Wi-Fi antennas are routed onto here. It even has the warning at the bottom. Definitely heed that warning, but it does have at least the 1TB SSD and the 32 gigabytes of RAM. So not much upgradability here, but if you do need to replace the RAM or the SSD with anything, you can do that. Of course, it does come with a heat sink attached onto the SSD, so I can't exactly see what brand it is, and I don't really want to disassemble all that because it does have a thermal pad, and I hate having to take apart thermal pads. They never quite feel the same after you take them apart, and well, there's no real reason to remove this metal shroud. So we're going to close this thing back up, and we're going to get this system good to go. We are, of course, going to look at the body and just look at the kind of I/O that we have to work with. I am very interested to see how this is going to end up scoring in Cinebench in particular, because I do have an i9 12900K as the main CPU on my desktop, and well, it's going to be interesting to see its closest mobile counterpart. All right, those legs are very secure on there. They don't feel like they're going to pop out at any moment. You'd really have to be very abusive to this thing to take those out. But let's take a look at the I/O. At the front, we are looking at 2 USB 3.0 ports and a headphone microphone jack, and we do have a power button as well as a reset switch that is recessed, so you will need to use something thin to get in there, but you can use that. If we take a look at the back, we are looking at another 2 USB, but these are USB 2.0. We have a display port, which I do like to see the inclusion of display port. I know some people prefer the dual HDMI. I'm more of a HDMI and DisplayPort. I like having that flexibility. We do also have a 2.5 gigabit LAN port, though it is the single one, that's still perfectly fine. And we have a USB-C that it indicates there that it does do power delivery as well as display out. That's great to see. I know some people prefer having a USB-C in the front. I can understand that. I do prefer the one in the front, one in the back route, but if there is going to be only one option, I would rather it be in the back because this makes routing cables so much better. And of course, we do have the HDMI, as I mentioned before, and we have the barrel jack. So not crazy I/O by any means, but the overall construction of this system is very nice. They use these metal cases that feel great. This feels as high quality as the Alloy 9. And while the Alloy 9 is one of my favorite mini PCs that I've ever taken a look at, the construction is great. It was a great performer. And this seems to take a lot of the same design decisions that went into it. And the ease of upgradability is a huge plus in the sense that it's very easy to get in there. It has the rubber feet, but you don't have to destroy them to take them off. You can get in there very easily. The I/O, while not being incredible, is still going to be more than enough for the vast majority of users out there. And because we do have a i9 12900 HK, it should be a decent performer, but of course we are going to have to take a look at that. So let's get this thing plugged in and see what it can do. All right, so I have spent the last few days messing around with the Silver9 here, and I gotta say that I have some pretty mixed feelings about it. We're gonna of course jump in and take a look at some benchmarks, but for right now I just want to talk about the experience that I had with this. You can of course check the description for timestamps if you just want to jump ahead to benchmarks. But I do think that there are some things that are important to talk about with this system. For one, let's talk about the CPU that is in here, that being the i9 12900 HK. I have to say, I was pretty excited to take a look at this CPU. I have not had a chance to try out any of the high-end Intel mobile CPUs, even though 12th gen at this point is a few years old. Considering that 12th, 13th, and 14th gen are very similar to each other, it's really not all that far behind in comparison to modern day Intel. But there are some key points to talk about here. For one, the default TDP of this system, which is 45 watts, is just not enough if you care about multi-core performance, and you really should, considering that what other reason is there to get the 12900 HK? See, we're dealing with a 14-core processor that has 6 P cores and 8 E cores for a total of 20 threads. Those are some pretty impressive numbers, but with only 45 watts to work with for the TDP. The multi-core performance of this thing ends up being closer to a Zen4 8-core processor, and it still ends up scoring lower than it. The 6850H ends up getting a lead over it in multi-core, even though that's an 8-core 16-thread versus the 14-core 20 threads that we have here. Now, luckily, because it is an HK processor, you could very easily go into the BIOS and raise that TDP, and that's exactly what I did. I took it from 45 watts up to 60. But 60 is about the limit that you're going to reach for TDP, depending on where you live. I had an ambient temperature of about 71 degrees Fahrenheit, and with that, I was still reaching thermal throttling, but it was barely thermal throttling after a 10-minute test on Cinebench. And really, after multiple tests, it became clear that the thermal throttling is a minor issue. You're not really losing a lot of performance there, and it's still an overall jump in comparison to just the 45 watt TDP. And that's in an all CPU core workload. If you're using the GPU for things like gaming, then you're not going to run into any of these thermal throttling issues. And speaking of gaming, you might think that a 12th gen CPU might not be a good performer for gaming, considering that the older generation of Intel processors didn't necessarily have the best integrated graphics, but this had the best integrated graphics you could have at the time. This is using the Intel Xe graphics with 96 execution units. Now, this is the same that we saw with 11th gen in the 1195 G7, so quite a few years old at this point, but instead of being paired with a 4-core 8-thread CPU, it is instead a 14-core 20-thread CPU. So a pretty major bump in terms of CPU performance, but not so much in the GPU side of things. Of course, the gaming performance isn't exactly the reason that you would go with something like this. this. It's more the fact that you get a pretty decent CPU paired with a pretty decent GPU, but I'm struggling to find a niche that this fits all that well. Sure, if you need a high amount of cores for something like a home server, this does give you that option, but you only have one M.2 slot to work with, and you only have the one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet jack. So not necessarily the greatest option if you want to go down that route. Of course, the construction of the system itself is really well done. The all-metal construction, the well thought out layout for its I/O, but the expandability there is pretty limited. But let's look at some hard numbers. We're going to jump on over to the gaming benchmarks, and then we're going to take a look at the CPU, and I'll give you my overall thoughts after we take a look at those hard numbers. So the first game I want to take a look at is Civilization 6, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using the turn time test. Now, I kind of came into this one with some pretty high expectations, and I was a little disappointed. With an average turn time of 43 seconds, it falls behind even Zen 3 based processors, where something like the 6600H and the 6850H end up scoring around 35 seconds on either one, give or take a second, just depending on how many runs you do. That's a pretty noticeable gap that will end up adding up over time if you're doing a full playthrough of a campaign on here. And in general, it's a disappointing sight because I would have expected 12th gen to perform better, considering how in a lot of benchmarks you would end up seeing 12th gen performing better in gaming scenarios, usually CPU limited ones. This is a overall pretty disappointing result to me. It really means that there are cheaper AMD systems that are going to perform better in this title, so the price point of this system kind of becomes a tough sell if this is something that you're looking to do. And considering that this is almost a decade-old title, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect decent performance out of this. So the next title that I decided to take a look at is Counter-Strike 2, and this is one of those titles that I was hoping to get a little bit better performance, but overall it's not too bad. An FPS average of 72 with 1% lows in the high 40s isn't exactly terrible, and it seems to have at least aged better than some of those older GCN-based iGPUs that are in Ryzen 5000 series APUs. So while not an incredible result in comparison to what the iGPU was competing against at its time, it's not a bad result. Now the next thing that I want to take a look at is Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail, running with the standard laptop settings, and this does have FSR enabled, but it is with dynamic resolution scaling, and it's trying to get as close to 60 FPS as possible. And as you can see here, we're not getting that. With an FPS average of 44 and 1% lows of 28, it's not exactly the best experience, but for an MMO like this, you do have a little bit more headroom when it comes to the game being more forgiving. You don't necessarily need the highest FPS, but I don't know if I would really trust this to handle some of the higher level dungeons and raids that you can do in this title. Some of those missions can get really ridiculous on what it requires, and I just wouldn't trust it. But overall, this does end up giving us a standard score at the end of the benchmark. So the last title that I wanted to take a look at is Rainbow Six Siege, and this is about to get a major update with Rainbow Six Siege X. So this might be one of the last times that we get to see this version of it. But running with the lowest in-game graphics settings and using FSR at the quality preset, and that is FSR 2.0, not the original version of FSR, we don't exactly get the greatest level of performance. But it is still an above 60 FPS average, and those 1% lows are very, very close to that FPS average, so it's going to be a consistent experience, though its implementation of FSR 2 isn't exactly the best looking. Would really benefit from having access to FSR 3 and FSR 4, though obviously wouldn't be able to use FSR 4 on any existing APUs, and especially not any from Intel, but even having access to XeSS would be nice, though it already has FSR implemented. But now moving on to the synthetic benchmarks, and these don't necessarily represent how this is going to perform in your specific tasks, but they are good to use as a point of comparison with other systems. And while running through Passmark, which is a newer benchmark that I've started to use, it's been around for ages, but I've only recently started using it for testing. And well, we end up getting a Passmark score of 5,246, putting it in 58th percentile in their rankings. And it scores pretty great on all categories, being CPU, 2D, memory, and disk speeds, but where it falls behind is in the 3D graphics category, and that makes sense. Its weakest point for sure is that iGPU. It's just pretty old at this point, and it wasn't exactly the greatest performer in its time, though it was pretty competitive with what AMD had back when we were still using GCN for their iGPUs. It just doesn't compete with anything running on RDNA 2 or RDNA 3 and 3.5. Still, the CPU benchmark result does tell us that we are getting some great levels of performance out of this thing, and that really is the highlight. But moving on to the next benchmark, we do have Cinebench R23 running at 2 TDP configurations. I did test it out with the 45 watt TDP as well with the 60 watt TDP, so you can see what the difference is here. And at the stock 45 watt TDP, we get a multi-core score of 12,660, putting it just above the Ryzen 5 8600G, which ended up coming in with 12,536, and also very close to the Ryzen 9 6900HX, which had a multi-core score of 12,392. Not exactly great results, considering that one of those is a Zen 3 8-core and the other one is a Zen 4 6-core. And it also gets noticeably beaten out by both the Ryzen 9 6950H and the Ryzen Z1 Extreme. But by raising the TDP up to 60 watts, we do end up getting a multi-core score increase up to 14,657. So a pretty noticeable bump, because now it goes from having a noticeably lower score in comparison to the Ryzen 9 6950H to widening the gap and having a lead now over even the Z1 Extreme. But of course, the Z1 Extreme in that scenario is running at 30 watts, while this is running at 60. And look, Intel and AMD do their TDP math differently, so you can't compare one to one how much power consumption is actually happening there, but I can comfortably say that the Z1 Extreme is using less power. Still, that bump that you get in the multi-core performance is noticeable, and in those scenarios where you're looking to use every single core and thread that you paid for, that bump in TDP is really going to come in handy. And of course, there was no change in the single core performance on either TDP configuration. That's to be expected because it's just one individual core that has access to more TDP than it realistically could use because of the maximum CPU core clock that is put onto it. But the single core score of 1752 puts it just underneath the Ryzen Z1 Extreme, which is not too bad considering that at this point it is trading blows with most of the Zen 4 lineup of CPUs. The only things really taking a lead over it are ones that have just noticeably higher TDPs, or just ones that have noticeably higher maximum boost clocks, like the Ryzen 9 7945HX. So from the testing, you only get so much. What have I done with the system? Well, I tried video editing on there and I thought it was okay. It wasn't anything remarkable. I wasn't blown away. I didn't think that the extra cores really did much to help out in the actual editing process. At the end, when you're exporting, yeah, it did export kind of faster than in other systems that I've tried out, but in all honesty, it wasn't anything remarkable. It's decent though, and if you're looking for an editing machine that is a mini PC, it's not a bad option, especially because you do get the most powerful version of the Xe graphics chip. And considering how expensive Meteor Lake based mini PCs still are to this day, let alone anything rocking Lunar Lake. And Lunar Lake isn't exactly the most ideal for video editing because of its limited core count, though those cores are pretty decent. It's just so few of them that it's not exactly great. So this is pretty much a sweet spot if you really want to go down the Intel route, and there is some merit towards going with Intel in that scenario. While I personally haven't encountered any real problems using Adobe Premiere with AMD systems, because of the better support for quick sync in Adobe Premiere versus AMD's built-in hardware acceleration, depending on what you're doing, you could get a nice bump in performance, and more than anything, it really helps out with your exports. But I'm not exactly the type of person that does the most complicated video projects, so a lot of what I could do, I could realistically get away with on an i5 or a Ryzen 5. But the experience overall was pretty great, but it wasn't anything remarkable, nothing stood out, and considering that you hear 14 cores, 20 threads, you kind of get a little excited in terms of performance, and that's just not going to be the case here. So in my honest opinion, after using the system on a day-to-day basis for the last week, I'm going to recommend you get the Alloy 9 instead of the Silver 9 unless you have a very specific use case for this thing. The Alloy 9 just has better expandability. It has a APU that is more powerful than this, both in terms of single core and multi-core performance. It has a noticeably better iGPU while also having 32 gigabytes of RAM, but that's DDR5, and you get the extra expandability of an extra M.2 slot. The Silver 9 by no means is a bad product, but in a very competitive landscape, I think that Reatan themselves even sell better products than this, and that is the Alloy 9. If you want to go down the Intel route, it so far is the best Intel system that I've taken a look at. The build quality is fantastic. It just has some nitpicks to it that really drag it down. At the price point that it's at, it really competes directly with those AMD versions of mini PCs in general, and I would just go down the route of the Alloy 9 above this. Again, if you're really die hard in terms of going down the Intel route, it is not bad by any means. I was able to do everything that I needed to with it. I was able to record videos. I was able to edit videos. And of course, the day-to-day activities that you use a PC for work perfectly fine on it. But you're not looking at a system like this because you want to sit there and watch YouTube or Twitch while you doom scroll Reddit. That's just not what it's meant for. If that's what you want to do, there are systems with the N100 or with the Ryzen 5 6600H that will handle that absolutely perfectly. So at the price point that this comes in at versus what is around it in terms of performance and price, I think you're better off looking at the other options. So I'm going to leave a link to this down below as well as the Alloy 9, but I would really recommend that you consider the Alloy 9 instead of the Silver 9. I can confidently tell you right now that the Alloy 9 is my favorite mini PC that I have used pretty much ever. The build quality is fantastic. The performance on it is great. And they really thought out how they wanted to do the layout for the system. And honestly, it's a huge W. So check it out down below. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.